Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day and spending your time indoors. I thank you very much. I'm going to introduce now Julien Mailland, who is Assistant Professor of Telecommunications at Indiana University's Media School. He's also a research scholar with the Computer History Museum down the road with their Internet History program. He holds a PhD in communication from the University of Southern California and law degrees from New York University and the University of Paris. He's worked as an in-house counsel for dot-coms and financial technology companies. He describes them with a word I'd not seen before, fintechs.
Oh, yeah.
I guess I was the last person to learn that word, and does so in San Francisco and Stockholm and Paris. So his research focuses on telecommunications networks, ecosystems, design, law, policy, et cetera, and he's going to talk to us today about the history of Minitel.
Great, thank you. Welcome everyone, thanks for coming. Just a quick question, before you read the abstract for today, if you have read the abstract, how many of you guys had heard of that strange Minitel thing, out of curiosity? A few, and we also have an actual Minitel entrepreneur in the audience. Very few, okay. Well, that's cool. Just pretend it's 1983 and you're in France, and one day you go to the phone company and you line up at the phone company, or when they got too busy, they had some distribution stations in gymnasiums, and there would be a stack of boxes, and in those boxes would be a free computer called a Minitel. Okay, so everyone in France, starting in 1983, started being given free computers by the state. The phone company in most countries is run by the state. That's not the case historically in the US, but in most countries it is. And you would get this computer, which I conveniently have one. It's pretty fun when you travel with old computers. You get fun little notices from TSA telling you that they've opened your bags because they were a little puzzled about what you had. And they didn't really know what that was. Well, that's a Minitel. And as you can see, it is this little machine here. It's actually a dumb terminal. It doesn't have any processing power. You use it to connect to a remote mainframe server. It's a little screen, CRT screen, little keyboard, little modem. That was actually really revolutionary at the time because 1983 modems were pretty big, right? And it really made it really small and really sturdy. So that's a Minitel. And what I want to talk to you about today is how to use the Minitel experience to build the future of interactive online media. Okay, so Minitel was really the first time in the world that you had people at the level of a country going online and doing stuff online on the web that was really widespread, right? That wasn't the case in the US. And you had all sorts of online services, great variety, chat rooms that look something like this. This is what the chat room would look like on a computer screen. And I know there's a lot of gamers here and people working on games. It was one of the first times that you could go online and play games with other people. So this is an example. In this thing, you're kind of in a house and you're looking for other players and you interact with other players you don't know. Okay, this is 1983, right? Remember, not 1993. So that was really revolutionary at the time. For those of you who play Words with Friends, maybe on the Facebook platform, back then you could play a Scrabble with random people you'd never met. And of course, there was lots of sex, right? We all know sex was a big driver for the internet. It was a big driver for VHS technology. It was a big driver for a lot of communication technology. And certainly, a lot of people went on Minitel for sex. And the streets of France at the time really kind of got covered with billboards of half naked or completely naked people. And it was really a totally normal thing at the time. You wouldn't really see this in the US on that magnitude, but that's what happened. So why is this important? Well, there's a couple reasons, especially, again, as we think about the future of interactive online media, it's important to look back at history and look what's happened, what worked, what doesn't work. We can learn a lot from that. And Minitel is an important system, it wasn't the only online system in the 80s, obviously, but it's very an important one because it was the first time you had this kind of widespread use at the level of a country. I mean, again, basically everyone in France was online. If you look at the number of terminals that were distributed, it really went up really, really fast to reach about 7 million terminal for a country of maybe 50 million people. That's one terminal per 8 people. Not everyone had them in their home. A lot of people chose not to, in particular because it was very expensive. So if you had kids around, you wanted to hide the Minitel, right? But you had it at work. And you'll see that a lot of people were at work using those kind of online chat room for sexy chat. And the number of services also went up really fast. It peaked at about 25,000 services around 95. And then, of course, in 95, that's the privatization of the internet. The web comes around. People switch from this platform to the internet platform. And then the number of Minitel users collapsed. But it took a while. The network was in existence until 2012. Okay? And there were still about 500,000 people using it. A lot of them were farmers. The swine trade industry was basically organized around those little boxes. Every farmer had one, and you could check the rates and everything. So it's a big deal because of that. It's also a big deal because Minitel in Silicon Valley tends to be derided as the wrong thing to do, okay? You hear a lot about the virtues of the private sector and how Minitel was terrible because it was controlled by the state. And the proof that is brought by people who tend to have this type of argument is that the Minitel platform has been shut down. And Fred Turner, is Fred here today? Okay. Fred Turner gave a really cool interview to a French paper a few years ago. I have the quote in French. I'll translate it to you. Essentially, he says, in Silicon Valley, Minitel is considered as an example of what not to do. And it says it's horrible because Minitel was actually pretty cool. But then it says in Silicon Valley, it's a joke, okay? And it's a joke for the people presented as a joke because it is pitted again as a state-run, centralized, closed systems. And we're usually told about, the wonders of private industry that would foster innovation. And that's most certainly the rhetoric that is used by large internet service providers now, like Comcast, Verizon, or AT&T, as they try to fight net neutrality regulation, right? They say any sort of state intervention in the internet will destroy the internet. We must leave the internet entirely to the private sector. Well, I want to bring kind of a counter narrative to that, and I want us to think about how we can use the Minitel experience to devise better internet policies going forward, okay? Minitel was not really what it's been represented as in this region. It was not a closed, centralized, state-censored, backwards ecosystem. And certainly in some respects it was. But it was also a public platform for private innovation. The idea was for there to be a marketplace where private innovators could go and offer the services freely to the public, okay? And it was, in fact, a hybrid ecosystem that was at once centralized and decentralized, and we'll go over all of these points today together. It was both open and closed at the same times. And it was both public and private. So this forces us to think about shades of openness when we think about online platforms, when we think about game platforms, right? It's not all black and white. And the Minitel experience really forces us to think beyond kind of these binaries, right? And to help us find the right balance as we define public policies to foster innovation. So the underlying script here is that I do believe that some sort of state intervention is necessary, that you can't leave the internet and online worlds all to the private sector, and I'll show you why today. One of the lessons from this is that unlike what Comcast and Verizon and AT&T are telling us through their lobbyists and relentless public opinion campaigns that try to destroy net neutrality, more state involvement doesn't necessarily mean more control over private innovation. And less state doesn't necessarily mean less control over private innovation. And I'm going to make the case here that leaving the internet to the likes of Comcast with no state intervention is far more dangerous than having some sort of subtle, targeted intervention in the realm of online worlds and interactive media. And so again, it really is a matter of balance and nuance, and the story of Minitel helps us think through it, right? And so it's particularly important. Again, the story is not Minitel bad, private sector great. It's a lot more complicated than this. And it helps us think through the issue of net neutrality, right? So again, Minitel was a public platform for private innovation. At the time, in the United States, you didn't have public platforms for private innovation because the internet was not open to the private sector. And the platforms for online activities in the 80s, like CompuServe or The Source, were not at all open platform that let private innovators go on it. They acted as curators. They acted as the librarian who could tell you what you could see online and what you could not see online. That's pretty much what Comcast and Verizon and AT&T are trying to do when they fight net neutrality rules that forces them not to block or throttle services they don't like or services who can't pay them, like Netflix. Okay? Apple, when it runs the App Store, is a private platform for private innovation, and it offers a lot less guarantees to innovators because they're not a public platform and because they don't have to keep the public interest in mind. And sometimes their interests will align with innovators, and sometimes they won't. And when it doesn't, a lot of content is being kicked out. This is what happens with WikiLeaks in 2010, when Apple simply kicked out the WikiLeaks app from its platform. Okay? So if we don't look past those binaries of centralized, decentralized, open, closed, public, and private, we end up with a public debate that looks something like this. You got Senator Cruz when the net neutrality regulation with the FCC. But does everyone know what net neutrality is, by the way? I've been sent. Right? It's rules that the FCC passed that forces internet service provider to not discriminate against certain speakers. And the internet industry the internet service providers tell us that if the government steps in, it's going to be very terrible. Well, Ted Cruz picked up on that and he said net neutrality is Obamacare for the internet. The internet should not operate at the speed of government. And so in his mind, the second you got public intervention in online worlds, then the internet becomes this kind of bureaucratic apparatus. And some people at the other end of the spectrum are also thinking in terms of binary, and this is some random guy who tweeted a response to Ted Cruz, and he said, yes, it's a good thing net neutrality is Obamacare for the internet. And this guy clearly likes Obamacare. But the thing is, net neutrality has nothing to do with Obamacare. It's not a micromanagement by the state of what you can do or cannot do. It's just a non-discrimination policy, right? So that's one example where you have state intervention doesn't actually really restrict freedom. In fact, it increases it in a lot of ways, right? So let's go back to Minitel. By the way, this is kind of an offshoot, or I'm basing this talk on a book that's coming out in June with MIT Press. That I wrote with Kevin Driscoll from the University of Virginia, and we titled it Minitel, Welcome to the Internet, to again suggest that as we move forward with internet policy, it's important that we look at history. We don't have a visual for the book yet because the editors has not released it yet, but Amazon has decided that it was definitely a spring reading. So it's there if you want a good spring, a best new release in spring reading. Okay, so what was the need for Minitel? Well, Minitel really plays out on a backdrop of international relations conflicts between France, and the United States. Okay. At the time, that's the late 70s, the French phone network was a total disaster. It took forever to get a line. And American companies, especially IBM, were starting to build networks. And the French government kind of got the idea that if a French counter-proposal to this wasn't built, then France was going to be dominated by IBM, right? And you got to remember that's kind of 30 years after World War II, the Marshall Plan, and a feeling, I'll get back to that, a feeling that America is colonizing the world, right? That America is taking over the world through its culture. In 1945, the French Communist Party asked, will we be colonized? Okay. You know, there was really kind of this tension. Nowadays, that kind of concept has been called omni-Googleization, which has been defined by the president of the French National Library as a crushing domination by America on future generations' understanding of the world. But back in 1978, the enemy was IBM, right? So those two civil servants, Nora and Mink, wrote this great book called The Computerization of Society, in which they coined the word telematics. And that word telematics means the junction of the telephone and informatics, right? They say we're going to rebuild the phone networks. We're going to develop a computer industry that will help a content industry in the world of interactive online services develop. And we're going to fight IBM with that. But of course, there's a chicken and egg problem when you start a network or a platform is how do you get people to get on it, right? And in the field of telecommunications network, when you design a network, or a gaming platform for that matter, that's going to compete with another existing gaming platform is, you got this thing called network effects. Network effects basically means that the network only has value to you if there's other people on the network. And so of course, so for example, the value of a phone to me is only has value if there's other people who have phones, right? If there's no one to call, that network has no value. So the question is, who's going to be the first to buy the phone? And you're not going to buy the phone unless other people do it, right? So it really is a chicken and egg problem. And the way to solve it a lot of times is to prime the pump, which is to create kind of an artificial stimulus, right, to get people in the door. And in the economics literature, the quintessential example is the straight singles bar, right? You want women to come in so that men can come in, and men will not come unless there's women, so which one comes in? And so you prime the pump by doing ladies' night, okay? Ladies come in for free, they populate the bar, men come in, and then you get this thing rolling, okay? It's the same with computer networks. And this one is what we call a multi-sided market. Again, it's a platform for innovation, right? So the platform is somewhere where people meet, people want to exchange goods, services, or ideas. And in this particular case, the two sides of the market are the users and the content providers, right? And no content provider will go on and provide services unless there's people who are going to go and buy their services on that platform. And no user will go in unless there's actual content provider there, right? So what do? Back when RCA was manufacturing radio sets, they had the same problem. Is nobody would buy their radio sets because there was no content. And nobody wanted to create broadcast radio content because there was no one listening. And so RCA created NBC as a subsidiary to provide content at a loss for them so that people would buy their radio sets, right? Well, the French government flipped that on its head, and instead it gave free terminals to everyone so that there would be users for the platform, so that content providers would actually come in. And it worked. It also provided a free service. It was the free phone book. And so you could go and kind of Google yourself or find relatives, which at the time in 1983 was very, very innovative. And people in France, if you grew up in France at the time, you would go on and kind of play with a thing. It had very advanced natural language search features. I mean, it was really fun. And so people got on it. And then innovative service providers decided, hey, there's all these people with those computers at home. Why don't we provide services to them? Okay, so this is where it gets a little technical. Stop me if anything doesn't make sense. Here's how the ecosystem looked like. So again, you really want to think about it as a platform, as an ecosystem. Okay, I'll go through this pretty quickly. So you got your user. I'll go back here because the clicker is not being very friendly with me. You got your user, and your user will plug the machine on the telephone network. Okay, and this is how you represent it in computer science. That's the plain old telephone network, right? That telephone network is connected to a digital network by a gateway that is maintained by the telephone company, the PTT. Again, in most countries in the world, before kind of the mid-90s, the telephone company was part of the Post, Telegraph, and Telephone Ministry, right? So that's the state. And that gateway connects you to a public data network, okay? So you can think of that gateway as your Comcast that brings a wire to your home so you can connect to the internet, right? So that's a digital network. And the gateway, if you want to know what it looks like this. It's a really, really big piece of equipment. This one was manufactured by Alcatel. And so that gateway, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that gateway connects you to servers. And I don't know why there's no white dot over there. There should be, but it doesn't matter. Those are servers on the side of the network, right? This is where the content is hosted. And what you can see here is that those servers are actually decentralized to the edges of the network, right? So Minitel wasn't quite end-to-end like you have nowadays with the internet, okay? But the servers were not maintained, and that's the very important part, is they were not maintained by the state. They were not maintained by one person. They were privately controlled. Anyone could get on there, connect their server, provide their services. Kind of like the internet in '95 when it got privatized, right? And anyone could start hosting their own little homepage, built-in HTML. For those of you guys who are old enough to remember that, that's probably half the crowd here. Okay, so that's very important. And then those servers hosting contents, we'll put two here, are connected using virtual circuits. At the time, we didn't use TCP/IP. We used virtual circuits. I'm not going to go into details about this. It's just a different way to route data over a packet network. It's not very important for our purpose. But basically, you wanted, as a user, to connect to server number one. To get service number one, you would dial the phone number. And in Minitel, usually those numbers were 3615 followed by a short code. Okay, so you dial 3615, whatever, it would take you to that site. And then if you wanted to go to a different site, you would dial 3615, whatever, and it would connect you to the other server. Now, those servers were not interconnected to each other, and that's actually pretty important. Meaning that, meaning that if you want to talk to server 2, the operator has to agree for you to talk to server 2. Okay? Just the same that if you want to connect to Netflix, and Comcast maintains your gateway, Comcast has to agree to connect you to Netflix, right? Doesn't work exactly the same way, but they can block Netflix, which is essentially the same, right? So Comcast and your internet service providers essentially have the same power that the French Post, Telegraph, and Telephone Ministry had, but of course they're subject to different constraints, right? Because the PTT is the state, and the state is bound to certain duties by the Constitution, right? One of them being due process. The other one being to let you speak freely. Comcast not being the state, they're not subject to those constraints, right? Remember that. We'll get back to that. So essentially, the PTT had the power to exclude whatever speaker they wanted, but because they were the state, they were subject to certain rules. Now, okay. Minitel was completely plug and play, and that was really parts of its success, especially if you compare it to similar systems in the 80s in the United States, like CompuServe or AOL or The Source. You had to have a subscription to those systems. With Minitel, you needed no subscription at all. You took this machine, which literally you went to the post office and they would hand you a box. You would take it home, okay? You would plug it on your phone. It's right there on your phone line, I mean the phone socket, and you would plug it on the electrical, and that's it. You were online and you would dial whatever service you wanted. 3615 SM is one of them. We got the founder there. Hopefully you interject at some point, Danielle. And you didn't have to have a subscription to that service. And the way it was built is that at the end of the month, so the phone company would account for whatever traffic you used. And at the end of the day, they would say, okay, you've been online for 20 hours. We're going to charge you $2 per minute. You now owe us X number of money. It was very expensive. It was also very expensive in the US at the time, by the way. And then you would get a bill at the end of the month. So you didn't need a subscription. And that really lowered the barriers to entry for people to get online, right? You didn't need to wait for that password to be sent to you through snail mail, right? And AOL actually kind of had a thing of genius because they realized in order to solve that problem, they could distribute a bunch of disks, right, to make their service more plug and play. And so the fact that the system was centralized into the phone company being the operator enabled a really original micropayment system called the kiosk, okay? A kiosk is a place where, it's a platform where buyers of newspapers and sellers of newspapers meet. They don't actually have to talk to each other, right? The newspapers are delivered in the morning. The users come, they pay the kiosk operator. The kiosk keeps a little bit of money and then gives the rest of the money to the newspaper creator, right? Minitel operated under the exact same system. And so that centralization aspect in the gateway enabled the post office to calculate how much time you spend on server 1, how much time you serve on server 2, bill you. You better pay if you didn't want your phone line to be cut. And then they would keep 1/3 and they would give back 2/3 to the content creator. Does that business model ring a bell? Do we use this today in online worlds? Does that, anyone? What's that? The App Store. That's exactly the same system, right? You got Apple controlling, and Google too, I mean, Apple started it. Apple takes your money and it gives, it's the exact same split. It's 2/3, 1/3, right? So Apple clearly got that system from there. So Minitel was centralized in a way, but it was also very open in a way because the servers were on the side and anyone, any entrepreneur could plug onto them. In the US at the time, it was very different. US systems like CompuServe, The Source, were much, much more closed, right? So you had all of these things, The Source, Dow Jones, CompuStore, CompuServe, there were a ton of them. And the way that they worked really was they used one big mainframe, okay? So instead of having your virtual circuit go to servers that are privately owned on the side, they run their own mainframe, okay? And they control the content, which enabled them to exclude content whenever they wanted. For example, in 1986, The Source kicked out, overnight, they kicked out the World Book Encyclopedia and they replaced it by the Grolier Online Encyclopedia. No reason, no due process, that was it. They decided what content you could use, you could read what content you could not read, just like a librarian, okay? If Comcast is allowed to do that, tomorrow they can decide you can't watch Netflix anymore, right? So that's what the world in the US in the 80s looked like. And ironically, when France Telecom, which operated the thing in France, decided to launch a Minitel system in San Francisco, they call it 101 Online, And they hired John Cote from The Well. How many of you guys know about The Well? 5 people. Okay, The Well was a very influential bulletin board in the San Francisco Bay Area. A lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs were on it in the 80s. A lot of deadheads used it to trade tapes and things like that. It was very, very influential. And John Cote was the guy who was running it. France Telecom decided, okay, we're going to hire the cool guy, right? Mr. Cool. But the problem is that instead of running one-on-one online like Minitel, that was some of the flyers, they run it like US networks were run at the time, right? They controlled all the content. And so what you see is that the US networks of the times were much more centralized, much more closed than Minitel was. Minitel was much more decentralized and much more open, right? So this helps to think through those boundaries. It also shows that not every system is either closed or open, centralized or decentralized. It can be a little bit of both, right? And when we think about what public strategies to implement going forward to foster innovation in online worlds, again, we need to think past open, closed, centralized, decentralized. We need to think about nuances to help us figure out what targeted state intervention would work to make online worlds more free, more open, right? So we've gone over the Apple stuff. So those systems were curators. Again, I'll skip through this. Minitel, by the way, was internationally open. It was connected. So this is France Telecom tried to market this internationally. That part didn't work. But you can see here that from France, you could actually connect to the US to Telenet and TimeNet, which were the 2 main public data networks in the US. And you could also call Minitel a server in France from the United States, right? So you do have that element of openness that shows you that it wasn't kind of this controlled state bureaucratic thing, right? Let me see. Oh yeah, and by the way, just to show you, this machine here, I don't have the setup for it here, but we figured out a way that we could actually connect it to the internet. And when I show this to my students, I have them tweet to my Twitter handle, which is at Minitel Research. And I tell them if you tweet during class for once, you're going to get extra credit. And the machine is connected to the internet, and the tweets actually scroll down on the screen in real time. What that shows you is that machine was pretty damn open, right? That's a computer from 1983 that worked using virtual circuits, not TCP/IP. And you can somehow rig it to get tweets on it, right? So it's not that closed systems that a lot of people in Silicon Valley would want you to think. And the question is, was it neutral? Was it a common carrier? Common carrier is the legal category that the FCC has decided the ISPs, the Internet Service Providers, are in. If you're a common carrier, you're like the post office or you're like the phone company. You can't discriminate against your customers. That means the post office cannot refuse to carry porno magazines from point A to point B. The phone company cannot censor your speech when you talk to someone. And the ISP cannot block Netflix. Okay? The ISPs are resisting this. They are suing left and right, the FCC. We're going to see what happens with the new administration. But if they're not forced by the government to be a common carrier, that means they will be, in the future, able to discriminate against content they don't like, to tell you what to do online. So if private enterprise has its way in a way that is completely unregulated, we're going to end up with a lot less freedom than we will if there is some sort of state intervention, right? I'm not saying that the state should take over the interwebs and start running the network. Personally, now that we know that there are shades beyond those boundaries, beyond Minitel bad, private industry good, we can certainly think better about what targeted state intervention would be better to restore the public interest with what those corporations are doing. And so, ironically, Minitel was not completely neutral. Originally, the PTT, again, saw itself as neutral, and it started talking about the neutrality of the public service of telecommunication, and it said, anyone can plug in a server on my system. The problem is, in 1980, the press industry, the print press industry, realized it was on the verge of collapse. It was right. And so what it said is, we want a monopoly for distributing content over Minitel. And if we don't get that monopoly, we're going to collapse. And as a result of political pressure, the state gave them a monopoly to publish. That monopoly was quickly kind of, people went around it. So at the end of the day, Minitel was pretty neutral, but you can see how the private sector, in a lot of times, plays against the public interest, right? In this case, it was the private sector that was against neutrality. So I'm going to skip a few things because I want to be done in about 10 minutes, so we have time for discussion. So just to sum things up, Minitel was centralized and closed, but it was also decentralized, open, and neutral. And in fact, it was used for radical activism. A lot of demonstrations. In France, we love to demonstrate, right? You're not allowed to graduate from high school unless you go on strike and demonstrate in the streets. I'm kidding, but I mean, it's what we do. And so a lot of those high school demonstrations were organized on Minitel. Right? So that shows you that even if the state was running some part of the platform, clearly it didn't control the whole thing because the platform was used for people to demonstrate against the state, right? Now, what's really cool, so it was public, but it was also private, as we've established. It was really a public-private partnership, right? And we forget a lot of time that Silicon Valley also benefits from public involvement. Mark Andreessen, who built the Mosaic web browser, that was the first browser, said, the internet would never have happened if it had been left to the private sector. And he's right. And so this was a great experience in public-private partnership. The standards were completely open. Every piece of the ecosystem was heavily documented. That's not the case of the iPhone, by the way. There were heavy, glossy documentation given for free for about every piece of the system, from the routers to the terminals to the visualization specifications, to the point that you can do some crazy stuff with those machines. This is the co-author of my book, Kevin Driscoll. We took a picture with a little webcam and then converted it into a format that this can understand. And using a little Arduino board, you can do fun little things like this. So this is the Minitel when it's offline. Okay. If you bring a little Arduino in the back, you can push little. Can you guys see the screen? If not, you're welcome to come at the end of the thing. So here I made some little visuals. Actually, Kevin made all those things, by the way. He's the hacker of the team. Here we made a little tombstone that says RIP Minitel 81 2012. So this is how it works, right? So you can push your content, and you can only do that because really the standards are really open. It tells you everything you need to do. This is kind of a little drawing of the network architecture, whatever. Okay, so that's the demo time. Okay, this is our website, by the way. If you go to minitel.us, we have a online museum with lots of pictures and lots of little fun things like this. Okay, so it was really a case of kind of venture capitalism à la française. The state published a lot of research about how do you go about making successful service, right? They even published kind of suggestions based on a lot of research that they did as to how do you structure a tree structure that makes the site appealing to people. So here I'm going to skip a bunch of things, but just to tell you that all of those things really led to radical innovation, things that we didn't really see appear on a large scale in the US in 1995 or even much more recently. Let's skip a little bit. Blah, 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 blah. We can always get back. Okay, so that's an ad for the Nest online thermostat. Well, in 1983, you could already do that at home by plugging a thermostat that would be controlled by your Minitel, right? So Nest really didn't invent anything. So you had a lot of connected devices. They built terminals with credit cards built in, okay? Early in the 80s in France, you could pay with credit card through a connected Minitel in restaurants. Well, you didn't see this in the US. They still had those old machines, right, with the carbon copy of your credit cards. And then it really opened the road to innovations that we'd see later. So before there was Ask Jeeves and Siri, there were Claire and Sophie, who were basically natural language kind of search assistants. Before there was Webvan, there was telemarket, and you could buy food and it would be delivered to you same day. Before there was Ticketmaster, there was Billettel. Before there was E-Trade, you could trade online. If you've heard of the SETI at home effort, there was stuff like that. People were trying to talk to Martians already. And of course, there was that thing that we call the pink Minitel, okay? And these were the chat rooms where people lived their fantasies online. And that was a huge, huge money maker. So before there was whitehouse.com, don't do your research paper on the United States government on that website, kids. There was a lot of interesting ads in all of the streets of Paris. And they were more or less racy, more or less fun, more or less explicit, but they all talked about the same thing, right? These were chat rooms where you could come and talk. They were straight, they were gay. This is a little pun. This is between us dudes. There's little bananas here. And some were very subtle. This one is them, he and she are on SM. We have the founder of SM here. By the way, we've done, if you're interested in this thing, we've done at the Computer History Museum a really long interview of the founder of the SM service that you can watch on YouTube. Some of them were funny. This is Le Monde, so it's kind of the equivalent of the New York Times, right? Every corporation had their 3615 site, right? And every corporation had a little chat room on the side. And these guys were like, well, we're mostly IQ. Q in French, the sound also sounds like butt. And this is, of course, their little ad, right? So there was a lot of that. And one of the reasons there was a lot of that was because of the privacy protections that were built in. Basically, this was completely anonymous, both on the upstream and the downstream. And they didn't use cookies. And as a result, people at work started spending a whole lot of time surfing the sexy chat rooms because their compliance people could see, well, okay, you spent an hour in Minitel. Well, yes, I was researching prices for our competitors, right? So you could basically go online at work and do some little sexy chat. And it really triggered a bunch of innovations at that level too. So you had fake, it was mostly male college students who pretended to be women to chat with you. This is a rendition. Notice the empty fridge and the bottle of Jack. And a lot of innovations kind of were created there. A lot of these systems, basically you had these students chatting with 15 different people at once, pretending to be different people. Bots were created to go kind of try and take people from competing services and say, why don't you come chat with me in my chat room, it's better, et cetera, et cetera. So I will finish this by concluding this. What's next? We need to think about net neutrality. It's very important. If we don't, very large corporations whose interests do not align with those of the public will impact the way that we can live our lives online. Okay? The Minitel project had the public interest in mind. And as a result, it enabled private sector innovations. Companies like Comcast do not have the public interest in mind. And when John Perry Barlow wrote his Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, calling about the dangers of regulation, what these guys had in mind was really kind of the dangers of government regulation of the internet. And what they kind of missed is the dangers that are brought by the fact that the internet now, unlike in 1994, is really run by private corporations, and their interests don't align with those of the public. And so when we think about net neutrality, we need to think about going beyond those binaries of state bad, private sector great. Because if we let that happen, we're not going to be protected, right? And so my suggestion, and we kind of end the book with this, is that we really need to start thinking about targeted state intervention that will actually create more freedom for people to innovate. And net neutrality regulation definitely is one, because it forces internet service providers to open up their pipes and to let anyone who wants to speak over the internet. So I will close with that, so we can move to the questions. My contact info is somewhere here.